90 million years ago, something was already the biggest predator in the ocean. And it wasn't a shark. It wasn't a reptile. It didn't have a single bone in its body. For 200 years, we told ourselves a very simple story about who ruled the ancient seas. We drew pictures of it in textbooks. We built museum halls around it. We put it on the cover of every dinosaur book you owned as a kid. Giant reptiles with teeth the size of bananas. Sharks that could swallow a car. That was the story. That was always the story. It was wrong. In 2026, a small group of paleontologists in Japan sat down with a box of broken, black, unimpressive-looking rocks. Most of them were fragments, chipped, worn. The kind of thing a museum volunteer might glance at for 2 seconds before setting it back in a drawer marked unidentified. But one of the scientists picked up a single piece, a curved, beak-shaped chunk of fossilized tissue, and realized it didn't match anything in the catalog. It was too big. Not big like, oh, that's a large specimen. Big like impossible. Big like something had bitten prey in the late Cretaceous ocean with a mouth 1.5 times larger than the mouth of the largest squid alive on Earth today. And squid don't have small mouths to begin with, so they did what scientists do. They didn't panic. They didn't announce anything. They spent years quietly hunting for more pieces of the puzzle, sifting through drawers of misidentified fossils in Canada, cross-referencing decades-old collections, running the beak through comparative models built from living animals in the deep Pacific. And piece by piece, a picture began to emerge that nobody in the field was prepared for. Something with 8 arms, no skeleton, and a beak like a parrot from hell had been quietly the apex predator of an entire ocean. For millions of years, while sharks and sea reptiles swam right past it, never knowing what was watching them from the dark. They gave it a name, Nana-Amoteuthis haggardi. And by the time you finish this video, you are going to understand exactly why some of the world's leading cephalopod experts are calling it, without exaggeration, one of the most important invertebrate fossils ever found. And why other equally credible scientists are standing up and saying, wait a minute, slow down, this can't possibly be that big. Because here's the strange part of this story. This isn't a clean, tidy discovery with a Hollywood ending. This is real science, happening in real time, argued over in real journals, by real people who disagree with each other. And that disagreement is actually the most fascinating part of everything you're about to hear. Stick with me, because we are going to build this story the way the scientists built it, from a single, unidentified fragment, all the way up to a sea monster the length of a city bus. We'll walk through the myths that came before it, the ancient ocean it lived in, the detective work that uncovered it, the terrifying anatomy hidden in its bite marks, and the raging scientific argument about whether this animal was even more dangerous than we're being told, or whether we've all gotten a little carried away. This is the true story of the closest thing science has ever found to a real kraken. Let's go back further than you'd expect. Because to understand why this discovery hit the paleontology world like a depth charge, you first need to understand a myth that's been haunting sailors for over 1,000 years. A myth that, it turns out, was never entirely a myth at all. Before we dive in, let me tell you exactly where this story is going, because I don't want you to miss a single piece of it. We're going to start with the legend. The Kraken, the sea monster stories that terrified Norse sailors centuries before anyone had a name for a giant squid. Then we're going to drop straight down into the late Cretaceous ocean, 90 million years ago, and meet the cast of monsters that everyone assumed were running the show. The Mosasaurs, the Plesiosaurs, the armored sharks. You need to understand exactly how brutal and crowded that ocean already was, because it's going to make what comes next so much more disturbing. From there, we go into the actual detective work, the fossils, the broken jaws, the years of quiet research that most people will never hear about, because it doesn't make headlines the way Giant Sea Monster does. I'm going to walk you through exactly how you can estimate the size of an entire soft-bodied animal from a single hard mouthpart, because it is one of the cleverest pieces of scientific reasoning I have come across, and once you understand the method, you'll never look at a fossil fragment the same way again. Then we get to the reveal, Nana-Amoteuthis. What it actually was, what family of octopus it belonged to, how big it really got. And I promise you, the honest number is still shocking even without the exaggeration. We'll look at the bite marks preserved in its own mouth that tell us how it hunted, what it ate, and possibly even whether it had a dominant side, the way you're right-handed or left-handed. That detail alone has massive implications for how intelligent this animal might have been. After that, we're going to sit with the controversy, because I refuse to give you a one-sided story. Not every scientist agrees with the biggest size estimate, and their objections are completely reasonable. I'll lay out both sides so you can decide for yourself. Then we zoom out. Because this isn't the only oversized invertebrate the ocean has ever produced, and understanding the pattern tells us something uncomfortable about how much of prehistoric life we still don't know exists. And finally, we come back to today, to the actual living relatives of this creature, quietly existing in the deep ocean right now, and to the unsettling question hanging over this entire field. If an animal this size could hide from science for 90 million years, what else is still down there? All right. Let's start where every good monster story starts. With sailors, at night, staring into black water, absolutely certain that something was staring back. Norway, sometime around the 12th century. A group of sailors is working a fishing ground far off the coast, an area that, according to the old sagas, always seemed to teem with fish for no obvious reason. No one questioned it too hard, because good fishing was good fishing. But the old stories whispered a reason why the water there was so alive. They said something enormous was breathing beneath it. The Norse called it the Kraken, and the earliest written descriptions we have paint a picture that sounds less like an animal and more like a geographic feature that occasionally decided to move. Sailors described a creature so vast that when it surfaced, they mistook its back for a newly formed island. Some accounts claim men actually anchored their boats on it, lit fires, and only realized their mistake when the island began to sink beneath them, dragging the fishing lines and sometimes the ship down into the deep. Whether or not that specific detail ever happened is beside the point. What matters is this: the fear was consistent, cross-cultural, and it did not go away. It got written into ship logs. It got passed from Norwegian sailors to Icelandic sailors to the naturalists of the 18th century, who were desperately trying to catalog every living thing on Earth and had absolutely no idea what to do with these reports. In 1735, the father of modern biological classification, Carl Linnaeus, the man who invented the naming system we still use for every species on the planet, actually included the Kraken in the first edition of his famous work Systema Naturae. He classified it as a real cephalopod, a real, living animal with a scientific slot in the animal kingdom, right next to squid and octopus. He later removed it in subsequent editions, presumably once cooler heads and better evidence prevailed. But for one brief moment in the history of science, the Kraken was not folklore. It was taxonomy. Now, why would one of the most rigorous scientific minds in history take a monster like this seriously? Because sailors kept bringing back evidence. Not the monster itself, but pieces of it. Enormous sucker marks scarred into the flesh of sperm whales, sucker discs larger than dinner plates, arranged in patterns that matched nothing anyone had ever formally described. Whalers who hunted sperm whales in the deep Atlantic and Pacific would occasionally find, in the stomach contents of a killed whale, massive undigested beaks. Hooked, parrot-like mouths, clearly belonging to something enormous, something that lived far deeper than any human had ever been able to observe directly. Sperm whales dive over a kilometer down to hunt. Nobody in the 18th or 19th century could follow them there. So for 200 years, humanity's only evidence of the largest invertebrate predators on the planet came secondhand. Scars on a whale's skin and beaks in a whale's stomach. We were reconstructing a monster purely from what had eaten it, or what it had almost eaten. That is an astonishing scientific situation to be in. Imagine trying to describe an entire species using only bite marks and dental fragments recovered from someone else's dinner. And yet that's precisely what happened, decade after decade, while the scientific establishment slowly, reluctantly, moved the Kraken from myth to maybe to yes, obviously. Why did it take us this long? The turning point came through wrecked and stranded carcasses. Throughout the 1800s, unusually large, decomposing cephalopod bodies began washing up on coastlines from Newfoundland to New Zealand. These carcasses were often in terrible condition. Cephalopod bodies decompose fast and lose structural integrity almost immediately after death, especially the huge ones, because so much of their bulk is soft, gelatinous connective tissue with very little to hold it together once the animal dies. Early naturalists, working with rotting, collapsed specimens on a beach, sometimes misidentified them entirely, occasionally even classifying decomposed squid remains as an entirely new type of creature they called Architeuthis, literally, ruling squid, before anyone had confirmed it was the same animal seen on ship decks and in whale stomachs for 2 centuries. It took until 2004 for a scientific team to capture the first photographs of a live giant squid in its natural deep-sea habitat. 2004. Think about how late that is. Humans had walked on the moon 35 years earlier. We had already sequenced significant portions of the human genome, and we still had never seen, with our own eyes, a living giant squid in the wild. An animal that had been terrorizing European sailors in written records since the medieval period. The first video footage of a live giant squid in the deep ocean wasn't captured until 2012 by a joint Japanese-American expedition using low-light cameras designed specifically not to disturb an animal that lives its entire life in total darkness. Let that sink in. The giant squid. Real. Confirmed. Scientifically documented, growing up to roughly 13 meters including its long feeding tentacles, was effectively a cryptid, a rumor, right up until the early 21st century. Not because it was rare, because the deep ocean is that good at keeping secrets. And giant squid are not even the largest cephalopod we know about. In the frigid waters around Antarctica lives something even bulkier, the colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni. It doesn't grow quite as long overall as its northern cousin, but it is dramatically heavier, built like a torpedo instead of a whip, with swiveling hooks on its tentacle clubs instead of simple suckers. Hooks that rotate independently, designed to latch onto struggling prey and refuse to let go. A colossal squid was only caught on camera alive, in its own environment, for the very first time in December 2024. December 2024, not 100 years ago, not 50 years ago, within the last 2 years of this recording. I want you to really absorb what that timeline tells us. We are not talking about ancient history when we talk about undiscovered giant cephalopods. We are talking about right now, today. This week, possibly, some fishing vessel somewhere in the Southern Ocean is hauling in evidence of something we haven't cataloged yet, and nobody will know for years. So here is the point of this entire opening chapter, and I need you to hold on to it, because it's going to matter enormously by the time we reach the end of this video. The ocean has been hiding enormous, intelligent, soft-bodied predators from human science for the entirety of recorded history. Not small ones, not rare edge cases. Genuinely massive animals, some of them among the largest invertebrates that have ever existed on this planet, and we have consistently underestimated, dismissed, or outright disbelieved every single early report of them. The Kraken was never really a myth. It was a delayed discovery. And if that's true for the animals living in our oceans right now, animals we could theoretically catch, tag, and film if we just had the technology and the patience. What does that tell you about the animals that lived and died 90 million years ago, whose bodies had absolutely zero chance of surviving into the fossil record intact? Because that's the world we're about to step into. A world with no submarines, no deep-sea cameras, no whale strandings to examine. Just rock, just time. Just whatever happened to survive. And in that world, something was living that made the giant squid look like a garden snail. Let's set the scene properly, because I don't think most people appreciate just how violent the late Cretaceous ocean actually was. This isn't the calm, blue, tropical postcard version of the past that shows up in a lot of documentaries. This was, arguably, one of the most competitive, predator-dense marine ecosystems in the entire history of life on Earth. We're talking about the period roughly 100 million to 66 million years ago, the final chapter of the age of dinosaurs, though the real action for our story happens between about 100 million and 72 million years ago. Sea levels were dramatically higher than they are today. In some estimates, over 100 meters higher, which meant huge portions of the continents that are dry land right now were shallow, warm, nutrient-rich inland seas. North America, in particular, was split almost in half by a vast body of water called the Western Interior Seaway, stretching from what is now the Arctic Ocean all the way down toward the Gulf of Mexico. Picture that for a second. A shallow, warm sea cutting the continent in two, filled with an explosion of marine life because shallow, sunlit water is exactly the kind of place where food chains go into overdrive. Plankton blooms feed small fish. Small fish feed bigger fish. Bigger fish feed things that, frankly, should not have existed. Let's meet the roster, because you need to understand exactly what our octopus was up against, or possibly competing with for the throne. First, the Mosasaurs. These were not dinosaurs, despite constantly getting lumped in with them in pop culture. They were giant marine lizards, more closely related to modern monitor lizards and snakes than to anything that walked on land at the time. Mosasaurus itself, the largest well-known genus, could reach lengths estimated around 17 meters. That's over 55 feet of muscle, teeth, and raw aggression, propelled by a powerful paddle-like tail. Mosasaurs had double rows of teeth in some species, hinged jaws that could expand to swallow prey whole, and they occupied virtually every marine predator niche you can imagine. Some were built for crushing shellfish, others for slicing through soft-bodied prey, and the biggest ones were simply built to eat anything smaller than they were, which, if you were 17 meters long, was almost everything. Second, the plesiosaurs, an older lineage that had already been dominating the seas for well over 100 million years by this point. Some plesiosaurs, like Styxosaurus, had absurdly long necks, sometimes making up more than half the total body length, used, most researchers believe, to snake through schools of fish and snap them up with a rapid sideways strike, like a heron hunting in a pond, except the heron was 12 meters long and swimming in open ocean. Third, the sharks. And this is where things get genuinely bizarre. Tychodus was a genus of shark that grew to roughly 10 meters in length but had completely abandoned the slicing predator shark stereotype. Instead of blade-like teeth, Tychodus had rows of flattened, pavement-like teeth, essentially built like a nutcracker, specifically evolved to crush the armored shells of ammonites and other hard-shelled marine life. A 10-meter shark whose entire skull was a specialized shell-crushing machine. Fourth, the bony fish, and here I need to introduce you to Giphanctanus, because this animal deserves far more fame than it gets. Growing up to around 5 or 6 meters, Giphanctanus looked like a tarpon that had been possessed by something violent. An enormous, fanged predatory fish with a lower jaw that jutted forward, packed with long, needle-like teeth. We actually have a famous fossil, nicknamed fish within a fish, showing a Giphanctanus that died shortly after swallowing another large fish nearly its own body-length whole. This was an ecosystem where the fish were trying to eat other fish that were almost as big as they were. So that's the environment. A shallow, warm, brutally competitive ocean, patrolled by giant armored lizards, long-necked reptiles, shell-crushing sharks, and aggressive apex predator fish, all of them stacked on top of each other in an ecological pressure cooker that had been running, essentially unchallenged in its basic structure, for tens of millions of years. Every single textbook account of this ecosystem, for the entire history of paleontology, describes it the same way: vertebrates on top, invertebrates below. Reptiles, sharks, and fish were the predators. Ammonites, clams, and cephalopods were, for the most part, treated as food, or at best, as mid-tier hunters. Clever, but not competitors for the very top of the food chain. There's a real, structural reason this assumption formed, and it's worth understanding, because it isn't just old-fashioned bias. It's a genuine limitation of the fossil record itself. Vertebrates have bones. Bones are mineralized, dense, relatively durable, and they fossilize comparatively well under the right conditions. A 17-meter mosasaur, when it died and sank to the seafloor, left behind a skeleton, sometimes an entire, articulated skeleton, that could survive, buried in sediment, for tens of millions of years, and could be excavated more or less intact by a museum team with brushes and handpicks. A giant cephalopod, by contrast, is almost entirely soft tissue. Muscle, skin, ink sacs, arms, a mantle. The octopus or squid equivalent of a torso. None of it has any mineral component whatsoever. When a cephalopod dies, decomposition and scavengers typically destroy the body within days, sometimes hours, long before sediment can bury and preserve it. There is exactly one hard part in the entire body of most cephalopods: the beak, a small, chitinous, parrot-like mouthpart, similar in material to a fingernail or a bird's beak, tough enough to survive digestion, tough enough to occasionally survive fossilization, and almost nothing else. So here's the uncomfortable truth that this whole story hinges on. For the vast majority of Earth's history, We have been reconstructing the balance of power in ancient oceans using a fossil record that is fundamentally, structurally biased in favor of animals with bones. It's not that vertebrates were necessarily always the biggest, scariest things in the water. It's that vertebrates were the only ones capable of leaving behind an obvious calling card. Every giant cephalopod that ever lived and died in the Mesozoic oceans, for the most part, simply vanished. No skeleton, no armor, no shell. Just soft tissue returning to the food chain and one tiny beak, if we're lucky, settling into the mud. This is why the discovery we're about to walk through is so significant. It's not just, we found a big fossil. It's, we found the one durable clue that an entire category of ancient superpredator left behind, and it took us until the 21st century to even recognize what we were looking at. Because somewhere in that violent, crowded, reptile and shark-dominated ocean, there was an 8-armed hunter with no bones, no shell, and apparently no fear. Quietly growing to a size that would put every single animal I just described into serious danger. And the only reason we know it existed at all is because, every once in a while, over the span of nearly 30 million years, one of them died in exactly the right place, was buried in exactly the right way, and left behind exactly the one part of its body tough enough to survive. Let's go find that piece. Every great scientific discovery has an unglamorous origin point, and this one is no exception. It doesn't start with a dramatic excavation under a blazing sun. It starts in a drawer. Fossil collections at universities and museums accumulate specimens for decades, sometimes over a century, faster than researchers can ever fully catalog and analyze them. Rocks come in from field expeditions, amateur collectors, construction sites, and coastal erosion, and they get labeled with whatever information is available at the time, then filed away for someone, someday, to look at more closely. It's not unusual, even today, for a truly significant fossil to sit quietly in storage for decades before the right specialist, asking the right question, finally picks it up and realizes what they're holding. That's essentially what happened here. Paleontologist Shin Ikegami and his colleagues at Hokkaido University in Japan were investigating fossil cephalopod jaws, beaks, recovered from late Cretaceous rock formations. Some of this material came from Japan itself. Some came from a famous fossil-bearing rock unit in British Columbia, Canada, called the Nanaimo Group, a sequence of marine sedimentary rocks that has been a productive hunting ground for Cretaceous marine fossils for well over a century. Now, fossil cephalopod beaks are not new to science. Paleontologists have been finding and describing them for a long time, and for years, a certain category of unusually large, unusual-shaped beaks from this period had been tentatively classified as belonging to vampire squid, a small, deep-sea cephalopod group known scientifically as Vampiromorphida, famous today for one surviving species, the vampire squid, Vampiroteuthis infernalis, whose scientific name literally translates to vampire squid from hell, despite the fact that living vampire squids are small, harmless, gelatinous animals that mostly eat detritus drifting down from above. The name is far scarier than the animal. For years, that classification sat unquestioned. Big, weird beak? Probably an oversized vampire squid relative. File it, move on. Ikegami's team decided to actually test that assumption rigorously, gathering as many specimens of these beaks as they could. 15 previously known specimens, plus an additional 12 newly identified fossils that the team managed to track down and properly analyze, bringing the total sample size up to 27 beaks spanning a substantial stretch of geological time. And this is where the detective work becomes genuinely elegant. So I want to walk you through it carefully, because understanding the method is what makes the conclusion so convincing. A cephalopod beak has a very specific, very consistent internal geometry, one that's been documented extensively across dozens of living squid and octopus species. There's a curved cutting edge called the rostrum. Think of it as the tip of the beak, the sharp point that does the actual biting. Behind that is a structure called the hood, a broader shield-like section. There's a pattern of fine parallel ridges called striations, running across the surface like growth rings, and a flatter region called the lateral wall. Every one of these structural components scales in a predictable, measurable relationship with the size of the living animal that owned it. Researchers have spent years building comparative datasets from living squid and octopus species, carefully measuring beak dimensions against mantle length. essentially the length of the animal's main body, excluding the arms, and against total body length, including the arms. Because these relationships are mathematically consistent within closely related groups of cephalopods, you can, with reasonable confidence, take an isolated fossil beak, identify which broader family it most closely resembles, and back-calculate an estimated size range for the entire animal, even though every other part of its body vanished from the fossil record tens of millions of years ago. This is, honestly, one of the most impressive pieces of forensic biology I've ever come across, and it's worth pausing to admire it. It is not so different, conceptually, from a forensic anthropologist estimating a person's height and build from a single recovered bone. You're using known, well-documented relationships in living or well-studied populations to extrapolate backward from a fragment to a whole. It works. It's been validated repeatedly. And hold on to this, because it becomes important later. It is still an extrapolation, not a direct measurement, and extrapolations always carry a margin of error that grows larger the further you push beyond your comparative dataset. So the team ran their 27 beaks through this comparative framework, and almost immediately, the vampire squid classification started to fall apart. The internal proportions, the specific ratio of rostrum length to hood shape, the pattern of the striations, the structure of the lateral wall, didn't match vampire squid architecture nearly as well as they matched a completely different group, the Cerata, commonly known as finned octopuses. If you've never heard of finned octopuses, you've probably still seen one without realizing it, because this group includes the internet-famous Dumbo octopus, named for the two ear-like fins protruding from the top of its head, which give it an undeniable resemblance to a certain animated flying elephant. Cirrate octopuses are deep-sea specialists, generally small, generally gelatinous, generally adorable by cephalopod standards, drifting gently through deep water using those fins for propulsion rather than the jet propulsion siphon system that squid and most other octopuses rely on. They also have webbing connecting their arms, giving them an umbrella-like shape when they spread out, and small finger-like structures called cirri lining their arms, which is where the whole group gets its scientific name. Nothing about a modern Dumbo octopus screams terrifying apex predator. They're famous for being cute. That's the entire cultural niche they occupy. Which makes it deeply strange that the team's analysis was pointing, with increasing confidence, toward this exact family being the true owner of some of the largest cephalopod beaks ever recovered from the fossil record. Beaks large enough that the biggest examples measured roughly 1.5 times the size of beaks belonging to living giant squid, animals that already reach lengths of 10 to 13 meters. Once the reclassification into Cerata was confirmed through detailed comparative anatomy, the team moved to the next stage, separating the specimens into distinct species based on subtle but consistent differences in beak shape and proportion across the 27 samples, and cross-referencing those groupings against the age of the rock layers each fossil came from. Two clear, distinguishable groups emerged. The older group, found in rock layers dating back as far as roughly 100 million years and persisting until about 72 million years ago, represented what the team would formally name Nanomoteuthis gillespii, a name honoring both the Nana-Imo group rock formation where key specimens were recovered, and a nod, through the species name, to a respected figure in the study of ancient cephalopods. This discovery alone was already significant, because it pushed back the confirmed fossil record of octopuses by roughly 5 million years, and pushed back the confirmed record of finned octopuses specifically by an astonishing 15 million years. That's not a footnote. That's rewriting a chapter of the evolutionary timeline of an entire animal group based on nothing but beaks. But the second group was the one that stopped the researchers in their tracks. Slightly younger, dated to a narrower window between roughly 86 million and 72 million years ago, this group contained the largest specimens in the entire sample. Beaks so disproportionately massive compared to every known living or fossil-finned octopus that initial calculations produced numbers the team almost certainly double and triple-checked before they believed them. They named this second species Nanomoteuthis haggardi. We'll get to exactly how big disproportionately massive turned out to mean in the next chapter, and I promise you, it's more dramatic than you're currently picturing. But before we get there, I want you to sit with the sheer improbability of this entire chain of events for a second. An animal with no bones, no shell, and a body that should have vanished within days of its death managed to leave behind a single hard fragment. That fragment then had to be buried under exactly the right sedimentary conditions to fossilize instead of dissolving or eroding away. It had to survive tens of millions of years of geological upheaval without being crushed, melted, or destroyed by tectonic activity. It had to be excavated, by chance, by a human collector, at some point in the last century or two. It had to be correctly transported to a research collection instead of being lost, sold, or discarded as an unimpressive-looking rock. It had to sit in that collection, correctly preserved, until a researcher with exactly the right specialized expertise happened to examine it closely enough to question a decades-old misclassification. And then that researcher had to be part of a broader effort dedicated enough to track down 26 more fragments scattered across multiple countries and museum collections, just to build a sample large enough to draw a confident conclusion from. Every single one of those steps had a realistic chance of failing. If any one of them had gone differently, Naniamoteuthis would simply not exist in the scientific record. It would be one more anonymous, extinct super predator that lived, hunted, and died in total obscurity, leaving absolutely no trace that it had ever been the largest invertebrate in its entire ecosystem. Which raises a question I want you to keep in the back of your mind for the rest of this video. How many other creatures just like it never got that lucky? All right, it's time to actually put a size on this thing, and I want to do it properly, with the real numbers, not the rounded up, headline-friendly version you might have seen floating around social media. Using the comparative beak-to-body relationships built from living cephalopod species, the research team generated size estimates for Naniamoteuthis haggardi by modeling it against two different living reference species that occupy roughly opposite ends of the finned octopus body shape spectrum. Using the proportions of Cerateuthis mulleriae, a relatively compact, small-bodied living finned octopus, the estimated mantle length. Remember, that's just the main body, not counting the arms. Came out to approximately 1.58 meters. That's about 5 feet 2 inches of mantle alone, on an animal whose living relatives today typically measure their entire body length in centimeters, not meters. But using the proportions of a different living species, Storoteuthis cirtensis, which has a comparatively larger, more elongated body relative to its beak size, the estimated mantle length jumped dramatically, to roughly 4.43 meters. That's 14.5 feet of mantle, before you even add the arms. When you extend either of these mantle estimates outward to account for arm length, using the body proportions typical of finned octopuses, you get a total length range for Naniamoteuthis haggardi spanning from about 6.6 meters at the low end to 18.6 meters at the high end. In feet, that's a range of roughly 22 feet to 61 feet. I want to be very precise about what that range means, because it's the single most important number in this entire story. And it's also the number that's generated the most controversy, which we'll dig into properly in a later chapter. The low end of that estimate, 22 feet, would already make Naniamoteuthis a genuinely massive animal, comparable in scale to a large great white shark. The high end, 61 feet, would make it longer than a city bus, longer than most mosasaurs, and would place it among the very largest animals of any kind, vertebrate or invertebrate, known to have existed in that entire ecosystem. For context on just how enormous the upper estimate is, the largest confirmed giant squid specimens, measured directly from stranded or captured bodies rather than extrapolated from fragments, top out at around 13 meters, or roughly 43 feet, and that measurement typically includes the 2 extra-long feeding tentacles that squid have and octopuses do not. Naniamoteuthis, at its upper estimate, would have exceeded even that number by close to 20 feet, without the benefit of those extendable feeding tentacles, meaning the size would have come almost entirely from an already massive mantle and 8 thick, powerful arms. The researchers themselves, in their published paper, were careful and measured in their language, but even they acknowledged that if the upper end of this estimate is accurate, Naniamoteuthis haggardi would rank among the largest invertebrates ever documented to have existed on Earth. Not just among cephalopods, not just among ocean animals, but among all invertebrate life across the entire history of this planet, a category that includes over 3 billion years of evolutionary experimentation. Now, let's talk about what kind of animal this actually was in life, because giant octopus conjures a certain mental image, and the real picture is a little different, and honestly, a little stranger. Naniamoteuthis belonged to the Cerata, the finned octopus group we introduced in the last chapter. This matters enormously for reconstructing how it actually moved and behaved, because cerata are built fundamentally differently from the octopuses most people picture when they hear the word. The aggressive, jet-propelled, ink-squirting reef octopuses you might see wrestling a diver in a viral video. Those are members of a different group entirely, the incerata. Finned octopuses, by contrast, are gentle drifters by comparison. Instead of relying primarily on jet propulsion, forcefully expelling water through a siphon the way most cephalopods do, cerata use a pair of muscular, ear-like fins mounted on the top of the head to gently flap and glide through the water column, more like a slow-motion underwater bird than a torpedo. Their arms are typically connected by a substantial web of tissue, so that when the animal spreads its arms, it takes on an umbrella or parachute-like shape. Some researchers have compared the swimming style of living cerata to a jellyfish or a slowly pulsing umbrella more than to a stereotypical octopus. Living species in this group are also almost universally deep-sea and cold water specialists, adapted to a slow-paced, low-energy lifestyle in the food-scarce environment of the deep ocean, where conserving energy matters far more than explosive speed. Now picture that exact body plan and that exact swimming style scaled up to 60 feet. This is not a fast, darting predator ambushing prey with sudden bursts of speed. Based on everything we know about how its living relatives move, Naniamoteuthis was almost certainly a slow, deliberate, patient hunter. An enormous, softly undulating shape drifting through the water column, arms trailing, using its size, its reach, and quite possibly ambush tactics or sheer overwhelming strength rather than speed to subdue whatever it caught. And that brings us to the single most physically dramatic piece of evidence in this entire study, the bite marks preserved on the fossil beaks themselves. Remember, a beak is the one part of a cephalopod's body that is genuinely hard and durable. Hard enough, in fact, to leave physical evidence of wear and damage from a lifetime of biting, crushing, and tearing prey. When the research team examined the fossilized beaks under magnification, several of them showed clear, unmistakable signs of significant wear. In some of the largest specimens, researchers estimated that up to 10% of the total beak length had been worn away or damaged during the animal's lifetime. Evidence consistent with repeatedly biting down on tough, resistant material rather than soft, easily torn flesh. 10% might not sound like much until you translate it into force. This wasn't a beak nibbling on jellyfish or soft-bodied worms. This was a mouth built for aggressive, repeated, high-force biting against genuinely tough prey, likely armored fish, other hard-shelled marine invertebrates, or potentially even the exoskeletons and scaled hides of smaller marine reptiles or fish with thick protective scales. But here's the detail that genuinely surprised even the researchers, and it's the detail I find most fascinating in this entire story. The wear pattern on some specimens wasn't symmetrical. It was more heavily concentrated on one side of the beak than the other. Think about what that actually implies. In modern octopuses, animals widely regarded as the most behaviorally and cognitively sophisticated invertebrates alive today, researchers have documented individual behavioral preferences, including a tendency for some individuals to favor certain eyes or certain arms more than others during specific tasks, a phenomenon that parallels, at least loosely, the concept of handedness in humans and other vertebrates. Asymmetrical wear patterns on a feeding structure, accumulated consistently over an animal's lifetime, are exactly the kind of physical evidence you'd expect to find if that animal had a consistent behavioral bias. A preferred angle of attack, a favored side for manipulating and crushing prey, essentially a dominant side, not entirely unlike being right-handed or left-handed. Finding that signature preserved in a beak that's tens of millions of years old is remarkable. It means we're not just looking at the raw dimensions of an extinct animal. We're catching a genuine, physical glimpse of individual behavioral pattern, fossilized directly into the evidence. Something researchers almost never get to observe in animals this ancient, let alone in invertebrates, whose behavior essentially never fossilizes under any normal circumstance. And this detail connects directly to a bigger question the researchers raise, one we're going to spend an entire chapter on shortly. What does asymmetrical, habitual, learned feeding behavior imply about the underlying nervous system and cognitive capability of the animal that exhibited it? Because in the living animal world, that kind of consistent behavioral lateralization tends to correlate with more complex neural processing, not less. It's the kind of evidence that starts nudging scientists toward uncomfortable questions about just how intelligent this creature might have actually been. Questions we simply cannot ask about a fossil shark tooth or a fossil bone, because teeth and bones don't preserve behavior the way a repeatedly used feeding structure sometimes can. So let's take stock of what we've established so far, because it's a genuinely staggering combination of traits for a single animal. We have a soft-bodied, boneless predator, potentially reaching lengths that rival or exceed the largest mosasaurs sharing its ecosystem. We have direct physical evidence that it repeatedly bit down with enough force to visibly damage its own mouth over its lifetime. We have evidence suggesting individual behavioral preference in how it fed, a hint of personality, essentially fossilized into hard tissue. And we have a body plan, inherited from its still-living relatives today, that suggests it moved through the water, not like a violent predator lunging at prey, but like a slow, deliberate, almost eerily calm drifting shape, patiently closing the distance on whatever it had decided to eat. I don't know about you, but personally, I find that description significantly more unsettling than a giant reptile with teeth. A giant reptile you can see coming. You can watch its silhouette, register the threat, and react. An enormous, slow-moving, softly pulsing shape the size of a school bus, gliding almost silently through murky water, giving away almost no warning until its arms are already closing around you. That's a different category of fear entirely. And based on everything the fossil evidence tells us, that's exactly what was drifting through the late Cretaceous ocean, sharing water with, and quite possibly preying upon, some of the very animals we've spent centuries assuming were untouchable. Let's talk about intelligence, because this is the part of the story that tends to get compressed into a single throwaway sentence in most news coverage, and honestly, it deserves far more attention than that. Octopuses, as a group, are widely regarded by neuroscientists and behavioral researchers as the most cognitively sophisticated invertebrates on the planet, and it's not particularly close. Living octopuses have demonstrated an extraordinary range of complex behaviors under controlled study, solving multi-step puzzles to access food, learning to navigate mazes, opening screw-top jars from the inside, using coconut shells and other objects as portable shelters. A behavior that some researchers classify as a genuine form of tool use, and in several well-documented cases, individually recognizing and displaying distinct behavioral responses toward specific human caretakers, essentially remembering and reacting differently to different people. What makes octopus intelligence especially strange, and especially interesting from an evolutionary perspective, is how fundamentally different their nervous system architecture is compared to ours. In vertebrates like us, cognitive processing is heavily centralized. The vast majority of your decision-making, sensory processing, and motor control happens in one place, your brain. Your limbs are essentially remote-controlled by that central hub. Octopuses do it almost the opposite way. A significant majority of an octopus's total neurons, by some estimates, roughly 2/3, are located not in the central brain, but distributed throughout its 8 arms. Each arm contains enough independent neural processing capacity that it can carry out surprisingly complex sensing and motor tasks with a striking degree of autonomy, even when partially disconnected from direct central brain control. Researchers have documented octopus arms continuing to react to stimuli, and even continuing basic food handling behaviors, for a period of time after being surgically separated from the central body in laboratory studies. A genuinely unsettling fact, but a scientifically important one, because it tells us that octopus cognition isn't just one brain. It's something closer to one central brain coordinating 8 semi-independent, quasi-autonomous subbrains, all working in concert. Why does any of this matter for a creature that's been extinct for 72 million years? Because the physical evidence recovered from the Naniamoteuthis beaks, that asymmetrical wear pattern we discussed in the last chapter, is exactly the kind of signature you would expect to find if an animal possessed this same distributed, behaviorally flexible nervous system architecture. Consistent, lifelong, one-sided feeding behavior isn't a simple reflex. It suggests a level of behavioral consistency, decision-making, and possibly even individual preference that goes well beyond basic instinct. Researchers studying the fossils have proposed, cautiously and appropriately hedged in scientific language, that this evidence hints at a level of neural complexity in Naniamoteuthis potentially comparable to what we see in living octopus species today. meaning this animal wasn't simply a mindless, reflexive killing machine reacting to stimuli. There's a real possibility it was capable of something resembling strategy, learned behavior, individual habit, possibly even a form of preference that persisted and reinforced itself over the animal's entire lifespan, physically etched into the one part of its body that survived to tell us about it. Now, I want to be careful here, because it's very easy for this kind of finding to get dramatically overstated in casual retellings, turning into breathless claims about a genius sea monster that could theoretically outsmart a mosasaur through sheer cunning. That's not quite what the evidence supports, and good science requires precision, especially on a point this exciting. What the evidence actually supports is more measured, but arguably just as remarkable. Physical proof that a creature this size, this old, and this poorly represented in the fossil record, likely possessed a genuinely sophisticated nervous system, was capable of consistent individual behavior, and may have approached prey with something more nuanced than pure blind instinct. Combine that cognitive sophistication with the raw physical statistics we covered in the last chapter. Potentially enormous size, powerful crushing bite force, and a slow, deliberate, ambush-oriented body plan, and you get a genuinely unsettling combination, not a mindless monster. A patient, adaptable, learning predator at a scale that, at its upper size estimate, would have made it one of the largest hunters of any kind in its entire ecosystem. There's a broader implication buried in here too, one that I think deserves more attention than it typically gets in coverage of this discovery. For the entire history of paleontology, we've had a persistent, largely unspoken assumption that big and smart don't tend to overlap very often in the ancient predator world. The biggest hunters in most prehistoric ecosystems, giant sharks, giant reptiles, giant crocodilians, are generally understood to have operated primarily on instinct, ambush, and raw physical power, rather than anything resembling complex problem-solving. Nanemotuthis potentially breaks that pattern entirely. If the size estimates and behavioral inferences from this study hold up under continued scrutiny, we may be looking at the first confirmed case in the fossil record of a genuinely massive apex predator that also carried the kind of distributed, flexible nervous system associated with the most sophisticated cognition invertebrates are capable of. That's not a small claim. That potentially reshapes how we think about the relationship between body size and intelligence across the entire history of predator evolution on this planet. But, and I promised you earlier I wasn't going to give you a one-sided story. May have, potentially, and suggests are doing a lot of heavy lifting in everything I've just told you. And in the next chapter, we're going to meet the scientists who think some of these inferences, particularly around the very largest size estimates, are being stretched further than the evidence can comfortably support. Because good science isn't just about the exciting discovery. It's about what happens after the discovery, when the rest of the field gets their hands on the data and starts asking hard questions. Here's something I genuinely appreciate about how this story unfolded in the scientific community. Nobody just nodded along and accepted the biggest, most dramatic number. Almost immediately after the study describing Nanemotuthis was published, other qualified cephalopod researchers, people who have spent entire careers studying ancient mollusks and are every bit as credible as the original research team, started raising, pointed, legitimate questions about the upper end of the size estimate. One of the most notable voices here is Christian Klug, a cephalopod paleontologist at the University of Zurich, a researcher with deep expertise specifically in ancient mollusks, who was not involved in the original study and was therefore free to evaluate its conclusions with a healthy dose of outside skepticism. Klug's public assessment, in essence, was that the largest size estimates in the study were, in his words, quite extreme. And he pointed to a specific, structural weakness in the underlying methodology that I think is genuinely important for you to understand, because it applies to a lot more than just this one fossil. Here's the core issue. The entire size estimation method we walked through in Chapter 3, using known beak-to-body ratios from living cephalopods to back-calculate the size of an extinct one, depends entirely on choosing an appropriate living reference species to model the extinct animal against. And as we saw, when the researchers tried two different reasonable reference species, Ceratothus muelleri versus Staurotuthus cirtensis, they got wildly different answers. 1.58 meters of mantle length in one model, 4.43 meters in the other. That's nearly a threefold difference in the estimated mantle length, purely as a result of which living species you choose as your comparative baseline. When your estimation method is that sensitive to which reference point you select, and when you have zero direct evidence of the animal's actual soft tissue proportions to check your assumptions against, the range of possible error grows substantially, and it grows in a way that compounds as you scale upward. Small proportional differences at a small body size translate into enormous absolute differences once you're extrapolating out to an animal, potentially the length of a bus. Klug's concern, shared by other researchers who've weighed in more cautiously, is essentially this. We are confident that Naniamoteuthis was a genuinely large animal. The beak size alone, which is a direct physical measurement, not an extrapolation, already tells us that unambiguously. But the specific upper estimate of 61 feet requires trusting an extrapolation method across an enormous, largely untested size range, based on comparisons to living relatives that are, in some cases, orders of magnitude smaller than the animal being modeled. Think of it this way. If you wanted to estimate the height of an unusually tall human being, and all you had was a single shoe, you could probably get a reasonably confident estimate if that shoe were, say, a size 11 or 12. Well, within the normal range of human shoe sizes, we have tons of comparative data for. But if that shoe were, hypothetically, 3 times larger than any shoe ever recorded, your estimate of the person's height, based on ordinary shoe-to-height ratios, could go dramatically, catastrophically wrong, because you'd be extrapolating so far outside your known comparative range that you have no real guarantee the same proportional relationships still hold. Maybe an unusually enormous person has proportionally smaller feet relative to height than average. Maybe not. Without direct evidence, you genuinely don't know, and neither did anyone modeling Naniamoteuthis. This isn't a case of one group of scientists calling the other group wrong or accusing anyone of bad science. This is exactly how healthy scientific disagreement is supposed to look. The original research team built a rigorous, carefully documented methodology using the best comparative data currently available, and were transparent about presenting a range of estimates rather than a single overconfident number. That range from 22 feet to 61 feet exists specifically because the researchers themselves acknowledge the uncertainty inherent in the method. Critics like Klug aren't disputing the existence of a large fossil cephalopod. They're pushing back specifically on how much weight should be placed on the most extreme end of a wide uncertainty range and reminding the broader public. And frankly, reminding excitable science journalists and YouTube narrators like me not to treat the highest possible number as if it were a confirmed fact. It's also worth noting that other respected voices in the field pushed back in the opposite direction, defending the reasonableness of the approach. Zoe Hughes, senior curator of fossil cephalopods at the Natural History Museum in London, publicly commented that while researchers only have the hard parts of this animal to work with, the ratios used to estimate its size are grounded in reasonable, well-documented comparisons to living examples, not wild speculation. Her framing was less about disputing the numbers and more about emphasizing just how remarkable it is that invertebrates, so often underestimated, could plausibly have reached sizes rivaling the biggest vertebrate predators of their era, regardless of exactly where within that estimated range the true figure eventually lands. So where does that leave us, as people trying to honestly understand what we actually know? Here's a fair, balanced summary. We know, with very high confidence, based on direct physical measurement of the fossil beaks themselves, that Naniamoteuthis haggardi had a beak roughly 1.5 times larger than that of a modern giant squid. A squid that itself can reach 10 to 13 meters in total length. That fact alone, without any extrapolation at all, tells us we're dealing with an exceptionally large cephalopod, quite possibly the largest ever documented in the fossil record up to this point. We know, with somewhat lower but still reasonable confidence, based on established comparative modeling techniques, that the animal's total body length likely fell somewhere within a broad range of 22 to 61 feet. And we know, with appropriately cautious uncertainty, that the true figure could plausibly sit anywhere within that range, and legitimate experts in the field disagree about which end is more likely correct. I actually think this uncertainty makes the story better, not worse. A discovery that's instantly, unanimously confirmed with zero pushback is, in some ways, less interesting than a discovery that's actively being argued over by serious experts in real time, because that argument is where science actually happens. The published paper isn't the end of this story. It's the opening move in an ongoing conversation that will likely continue for years, as more specimens are found, as comparative methods improve, and as researchers potentially develop new techniques to narrow down that uncertainty range. And this is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened out of most viral science content. A short-form video has 15 seconds to grab your attention, so it reaches for the single biggest, most dramatic number and presents it as settled fact. That's not malicious, necessarily. It's just a structural limitation of the format. But it does mean that if you only ever encounter stories like this through quick clips and headlines, you're consistently getting a distorted, oversimplified version of what real, ongoing scientific research actually looks like. Real science is messier than that. It's more honest than that. And frankly, I think it's more interesting than that, once you actually sit with the full picture instead of just the highlight reel. Now, with that fair and balanced context firmly in place, let's zoom out even further, because Nannyamoteuthis is not an isolated anomaly. It's part of a much stranger, much larger pattern in the history of life on Earth. One that should make you seriously reconsider what you think you know about which animals get to be called giants. Here's a pattern that most people never notice, because it's scattered across so many different corners of paleontology that it rarely gets assembled into a single coherent story. Nannyamoteuthis is not the first time in Earth's history that an invertebrate, an animal without a backbone, has quietly grown to a size that should, by conventional expectations, have been reserved for vertebrates. It's just the most recent, and arguably the most dramatic, example of a pattern that stretches back over 500 million years. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, to the Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago, during a burst of evolutionary experimentation so intense and so foundational that scientists simply call it the Cambrian explosion. The period when most of the major animal body plans we still recognize today first appeared in a geologically short window of time. In that ancient ocean, before fish had evolved jaws, before anything resembling a modern predator existed, the apex predator of the entire planet was an animal called Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris was an arthropod relative, not a true ancestor of modern crustaceans or insects, but part of that broader evolutionary branch. And it grew to somewhere between 0.5 meter and, by some estimates, over 1 meter in length. That might not sound enormous by today's standards, but you have to understand the scale of everything else alive at the time. Most Cambrian animals were centimeters long, sometimes just millimeters. In an ocean where the vast majority of life was smaller than your thumb, an animal over 0.5 meter long, with grasping frontal appendages and a circular, plate-lined mouth capable of crushing armored prey, was an absolute leviathan. For millions of years, the single largest, most dangerous predator on planet Earth was an invertebrate, full stop, and it ruled essentially unchallenged because nothing else had evolved to compete with it. Fast forward significantly, and you find trilobites. Probably the single most recognizable fossil arthropod group in the world, instantly familiar even to people with no interest in paleontology, thanks to their distinctive segmented, armored bodies. Most trilobites throughout their staggeringly long run on this planet, over 250 million years, an almost unimaginable span of evolutionary success, were modest in size, typically just a few centimeters. But some species, particularly certain members of a family called Isotelidae, grew to genuinely startling proportions, with confirmed fossil specimens reaching around 70 centimeters in length. That's a trilobite larger than a human forearm, larger than most modern crabs, at a time when vertebrate life in the ocean was still relatively primitive and small. Then there's the deep-sea giant that's still alive today and living proof that this pattern hasn't stopped. The Japanese spider crab, Macrochera camphrey. This isn't an extinct fossil. It's a living species, found in the deep waters off the coast of Japan right now, and it holds the record for the largest leg span of any living arthropod, with some confirmed specimens spanning close to 4 meters, nearly 13 feet, from claw tip to claw tip. An animal you could, in theory, encounter alive today, with a leg span wider than most car doors, and most people have simply never heard of it, because it lives quietly in deep water and doesn't generate the same cultural fascination as a shark or a whale. And then, of course, we're back to the cephalopods, the giant squid, the colossal squid, and now Nannyamoteuthis, representing at least 3 independent, dramatically different examples across an enormous span of geological time, of invertebrate lineages independently evolving toward genuinely massive body sizes. So why does this keep happening? Why do invertebrates, so consistently underestimated in popular imagination, keep quietly producing giants throughout the history of life on this planet? There are a few compelling hypotheses that researchers have proposed, and they're not mutually exclusive. Several of them are probably operating together in different combinations at different points in Earth's history. One major factor is atmospheric and oceanic oxygen concentration. During certain periods of Earth's history, oxygen levels in the atmosphere and dissolved in ocean water were meaningfully higher than they are today. Higher oxygen availability can support more energetically demanding, larger body sizes in animals whose respiratory systems are less centralized or less efficient than the lung-based systems vertebrates rely on. This exact mechanism is a major part of why we see giant dragonflies and other oversized arthropods in certain periods of the fossil record, when oxygen concentrations spiked well above modern levels. Another factor is simply reduced competition and predation pressure in certain environments, particularly the deep ocean. The deep sea is an environment where food is scarce, energy has to be conserved, and there is often less direct competitive pressure driving animals towards speed or defensive armor, and more evolutionary pressure towards simply maximizing reach, surface area for sensing prey in the dark, and overall size, which can improve an animal's ability to detect, capture, and digest infrequent meals efficiently. A third factor, and this one is more directly relevant to our story, is what researchers sometimes call taxonomic opportunity. Essentially, ecological niches that happen to be open, either because no vertebrate competitor has yet evolved to fill them, or because a mass extinction event has recently cleared out the previous occupants of that niche. In the case of Naniomoteuthis, it's entirely plausible that finned octopuses, as a lineage, found themselves with unusually favorable access to abundant prey and comparatively survivable levels of competition and predation during a specific window of the late Cretaceous, allowing a lineage that today produces exclusively small, deep-sea specialists to instead produce at least twice independently within the same genus, animals of genuinely startling size. Here's the part of this pattern that I find the most quietly unsettling, and I want you to really think about it. In every single one of these historical cases, Anomalocaris, giant trilobites, the Japanese spider crab, giant squid, colossal squid, and now Naniomoteuthis. We are talking about animals that either left an extraordinarily sparse fossil record, or, in the case of the living species, animals that spent centuries as rumor and myth before modern science finally caught up and confirmed their existence. That means the pattern we can actually observe and document across 500 million years of Earth's history is almost certainly a dramatic undercount of the true pattern. For every Naniomoteuthis that got lucky enough to leave behind a beak in exactly the right sedimentary conditions, how many other giant invertebrate lineages existed, thrived, and went completely extinct without leaving a single trace hard enough to survive the fossil record at all? We have no way of directly answering that question. And that's precisely what makes it so genuinely fascinating, and honestly, a little bit haunting to sit with. The story of life on Earth that we've been telling ourselves. Vertebrates as the dominant, headline-grabbing giants, invertebrates as the small, secondary supporting cast, is very likely an artifact of what fossilizes well, rather than an accurate reflection of what actually existed. Every time paleontology finds a new piece of evidence like the Naniomoteuthis beaks, it chips away a little more at that assumption, and forces us to admit that the true history of giant life on this planet is far stranger and far less thoroughly documented than our textbooks currently suggest. So if invertebrates have been quietly producing giants throughout Earth's entire history, and we're only now, in the last few years, starting to properly document them, what does that tell us about what might still be hiding in the ocean today? Before we go any further into speculation about hidden mysteries, let's ground ourselves in something concrete. An actual living giant octopus that exists right now, that you could theoretically go and see with your own eyes, and that most people know almost nothing about. The giant Pacific octopus, scientific name Enteroctopus doflini, is the largest confirmed living octopus species on Earth today. It's found across the cold coastal waters of the North Pacific, from Japan and Russia across to Alaska, British Columbia, and down through the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Unlike Naniamoteuthis, this is not an extrapolated fossil estimate. This is a directly measured, well-documented, thoroughly studied living animal, and the confirmed numbers are still genuinely impressive. Average adult giant Pacific octopuses typically weigh somewhere between 15 and 50 kilograms, with an arm span commonly reaching around 4 to 5 meters across. But the record holders push those numbers dramatically further. Documented specimens have been recorded at weights exceeding 70 kilograms, and unverified but credible historical reports, including specimens examined by researchers, though not always weighed under perfectly controlled scientific conditions, describe individuals potentially reaching upward of 150 kilograms with arm spans approaching 9 meters, nearly 30 feet from arm tip to arm tip. Giant Pacific octopuses are members of the Incerata, the true octopus branch we mentioned earlier, as distinct from the finned Cerata group that Naniamoteuthis belonged to, and they display exactly the kind of dazzling cognitive sophistication that has made octopuses, as a whole, into unexpected celebrities of the animal cognition world in the last couple of decades. Their well-documented opening jars, navigating mazes, distinguishing between individual human handlers, and in captivity, engaging in behaviors that caretakers frequently describe, cautiously, as playful. Repeatedly manipulating objects in ways that don't appear to serve any survival function, which some researchers interpret as a form of exploratory or even recreational behavior, a trait not often attributed to invertebrates. They are also, and this detail matters enormously for understanding why creatures like Naniamoteuthis are so hard to study even when we suspect they exist, remarkably short-lived. A giant Pacific octopus, despite its impressive size, typically lives only 3 to 5 years total. Most octopus species across the board have surprisingly brief lifespans compared to their size and complexity. Even the largest species rarely live much beyond that range, and some smaller species live less than a year. Combine a short lifespan with a completely boneless body that decomposes rapidly after death, and you get an animal that is, structurally, almost designed by nature to leave minimal evidence of its existence once it dies, regardless of how large or intelligent it was in life. This is a crucial point for understanding the broader mystery here, so let me phrase it directly. Even today, with modern marine biology, satellite tracking, submersible technology, and a global network of research institutions, our understanding of octopus population sizes, distribution, and maximum potential size in the wild remains genuinely incomplete. Giant Pacific octopuses are reasonably well studied specifically because they live in relatively shallow, accessible coastal waters close to major research institutions in wealthy countries with strong marine science programs. Most of the world's cephalopod diversity does not enjoy that advantage. The deep ocean. Anything below roughly 200 meters, where sunlight no longer penetrates, makes up more than 90% of the ocean's total habitable volume, and by most credible scientific estimates, somewhere between 80 and 95% of it remains completely unexplored and unmapped by direct human observation. We have, at various points, joked that we know the surface of the Moon and Mars in more topographic detail than we know the floor of our own planet's oceans, and uncomfortably, that joke is not far from literally true in many regions. Within that vast, unexplored volume of water, cephalopod researchers regularly encounter evidence. Video footage from remotely operated vehicles, unusual bite and sucker marks on whale carcasses, isolated beaks recovered from the stomachs of deep-diving predators, and occasional strandings of decomposed, difficult-to-identify carcasses, suggesting the existence of cephalopod species that have never been formally described, captured, or even photographed alive. This isn't fringe speculation. It's a mainstream, widely acknowledged reality within the field of deep-sea biology. New cephalopod species, sometimes strikingly large ones, are still being formally identified on a fairly regular basis, and marine biologists broadly agree that the true total diversity of cephalopod life in the deep ocean likely significantly exceeds our current formal catalog. So here's where all of this connects back to our main story. If we are still discovering new species of large, living cephalopods today, species swimming in oceans we can, at least theoretically, send a submersible or a research vessel to directly observe. How much confidence should we really have that the fossil record of ancient cephalopods, built almost entirely from a handful of surviving beaks, represents anything close to the complete picture of what actually lived and died in ancient oceans? The honest, scientifically appropriate answer is very little confidence at all. Naniomoteuthis is not evidence that we've now found the giant octopus of the Cretaceous. It's evidence that giant octopuses existed during the Cretaceous, and it happens to be the one lineage, out of who knows how many others, that got lucky enough to leave behind fossil evidence durable enough for us to find, recognize, and correctly interpret tens of millions of years and multiple rounds of scientific misclassification later. That's a genuinely humbling thought, and it's one that professional paleontologists live with constantly, even if it rarely gets articulated clearly in popular science coverage. Every fossil we find represents an almost unimaginably rare stroke of preservation luck, layered on top of an equally unlikely stroke of discovery luck, layered on top of the specialized expertise required to correctly interpret what's actually been found. The fossil record isn't a library. It's a handful of surviving pages, torn at random from a library that mostly burned down, and paleontologists spend their entire careers trying to reconstruct entire lost stories from those scattered, damaged fragments. Naniomoteuthis is one of those pages, and it happens to describe, however incompletely, one of the most remarkable predators that has ever existed on this planet. I want to take a brief pause from the hard science and do something a little different. I want to actually try to picture what an encounter with this animal might genuinely have looked like, using everything we've established so far about its biology, its behavior, and the world it lived in. I'll flag clearly that this section is a reconstruction. An informed, evidence-based narrative built from real data, but a narrative nonetheless, not a direct historical record. Consider it the responsible way of doing what that original short-form video was trying to do visually, but grounded in what the actual fossil evidence supports. It's the late Cretaceous, somewhere in the shallow, warm coastal waters near what will one day become the west coast of North America, roughly 80 million years ago. The water is a hazy, sediment-rich green-blue, illuminated by filtered sunlight down to perhaps 30 or 40 meters before the light fades into a deep, cool twilight. A juvenile mosasaur, several meters long but still far from full adult size, is patrolling the edge of a rocky reef structure, hunting for fish sheltering in the crevices. It's a capable predator even at this age. Fast, agile, equipped with sharp conical teeth built for gripping and tearing. It has no reason to expect danger from below. In its world, threats come from larger mosasaurs, from sharks, from things it can see coming, things with obvious silhouettes and obvious intent. Below it, resting against the seafloor in a shadowed depression between rock formations, something large has been sitting motionless for hours, its enormous webbed arms drawn in close to its body, its mottled skin blending almost seamlessly with the mottled rock and sediment around it. Based on everything we know about the camouflage abilities of living octopuses, animals capable of changing not just color, but skin texture in fractions of a second to match their surroundings. There is no strong reason to assume this ability, one of the most ancient and fundamental traits of the entire octopus lineage, would have been absent in a creature as evolutionarily related to modern finned octopuses as Naniomoteuthis was. The mosasaur drifts closer, drawn by the movement of a school of small fish sheltering near the same rocky depression. It has no way of perceiving the shape beneath it as anything other than part of the seafloor. There is no telltale silhouette, no sudden movement, no warning at all, until, based on the physical evidence of powerful bite force and the body plan of related living species, 8 massive arms unfurl outward with far more speed and reach than the mosasaur's threat assessment instincts were built to anticipate. I want to be honest and clear here. We do not have direct fossil evidence of Naniomoteuthis specifically attacking or consuming a mosasaur. That specific scenario is speculative, built from reasonable inference rather than direct proof. What we do have direct evidence for is a powerful, heavily worn, crushing beak, a body plan built around patient, ambush-style predation rather than pursuit, and an ecosystem in which mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and other marine reptiles were abundant and represented some of the largest available sources of nutrition in the entire food web. Whether Naniomoteuthis specifically targeted marine reptiles, opportunistically scavenged them, or primarily fed on large fish and other invertebrates, remains an open scientific question that the current fossil evidence cannot fully resolve. But the broader point stands, and it's worth sitting with. For the entire history of how we've depicted Cretaceous oceans in documentaries, museum dioramas, and popular imagination, we have consistently drawn every scene from the perspective of the reptiles and the sharks. Big, toothy, unmistakably dangerous animals with obvious visual drama. We've never drawn the scene from below, from the shadows. From the perspective of something patient, camouflaged, and enormous, quietly assessing every animal that swims overhead as a potential meal, using a nervous system architecture so different from anything with a spine that predicting its behavior with our vertebrate-centric intuition may simply not work. That absence. The fact that this entire predatory perspective has been essentially invisible in how we've reconstructed prehistoric oceans for the past 2 centuries is, in many ways, the whole point of this story. It's not really about one specific fossil, or one specific size estimate, or even one specific extinct species. It's about a fundamental blind spot in how humans have understood the history of predation on this planet. A blind spot created not by a lack of curiosity, but by the simple, unavoidable physics of what does and doesn't survive to become a fossil. I think it's worth stepping back at this point and talking about a process most people never really think about. How does a small research team actually turn a handful of broken beaks into a peer-reviewed scientific paper, complete with named species, size charts, and behavioral inferences? This isn't guesswork dressed up in scientific language. It's a rigorous, multi-stage process, and understanding it will help you evaluate not just this discovery, but every future headline you see about a newly discovered giant creature. The first stage is specimen acquisition and curation, which sounds unglamorous because it is unglamorous, but it's the foundation everything else depends on. Researchers don't just walk along a beach and stumble onto perfectly labeled fossils. They work through existing museum collections, cross-reference field notes, sometimes decades old, physically travel to multiple institutions across different countries, and painstakingly verify the provenance of each specimen, confirming exactly which rock layer, and therefore which time period, each fossil actually came from. Get this step wrong, and every subsequent conclusion collapses, because you might be comparing animals from wildly different time periods as if they were contemporaries. The second stage is comparative morphological analysis. Literally the process of measuring, in extremely fine detail, every physical dimension and structural feature of each specimen. The length of the rostrum, the curvature of the hood, the spacing and depth of the striations, the thickness of the lateral wall. Researchers typically use high-resolution 3D scanning technology for this stage now, rather than relying purely on physical calipers, because a fossil beak, especially one that's been damaged or partially eroded over tens of millions of years, needs to be digitally reconstructed to estimate its original, undamaged dimensions before any meaningful comparison can happen. This is precisely how the Nanaemoteuthis team was able to work with fragmentary, incomplete specimens and still extract confident measurements. Sophisticated digital modeling filled in the gaps left by natural erosion and damage, using known structural patterns from better preserved specimens. The third stage is statistical classification. Essentially, running the measured dimensions of each specimen through comparative models built from extensive datasets of living species to determine which existing group each fossil most closely resembles, and whether the fossils themselves cluster into statistically distinguishable subgroups, which is exactly how the team was able to confidently separate. There are 27 specimens into 2 genuinely distinct species rather than simply calling them all variations of a single population. The fourth stage, and this is the one that generates headlines, is extrapolation and size estimation, applying validated proportional relationships from living species to estimate the full body dimensions of the extinct animal. As we discussed at length in the controversy chapter, this stage is where the greatest uncertainty enters the entire process, precisely because it requires assuming that ancient, extinct animals maintained roughly the same body proportions as their modern relatives. A reasonable assumption in many cases, but one that inherently cannot be directly verified without more complete fossil evidence. The fifth stage, often overlooked by the public entirely, is peer review, the process by which independent experts in the same field scrutinize the entire methodology, the data, and the conclusions before a study is ever formally published. This is exactly the mechanism that eventually produced voices like Christian Klug's. Peer review doesn't stop the moment a paper is accepted into a journal like Science. It continues, informally, for years afterward, as other researchers examine, test, and sometimes challenge the original conclusions in follow-up publications, conference presentations, and public commentary. That ongoing, distributed scrutiny is not a flaw in the scientific process. It is the scientific process functioning exactly as intended. And finally, there's a sixth stage that rarely gets discussed at all, but matters enormously for how the public actually experiences a discovery like this: visual reconstruction. Every dramatic illustration you've seen of Naniamoteuthis, including, frankly, the wildly exaggerated sea monster imagery in that viral short-form video we opened this entire story with, is created by scientific illustrators or digital artists working from the published size estimates and known anatomical features of related living species, filling in enormous amounts of visual detail that simply cannot be directly recovered from a fossilized beak. Skin texture, exact coloration, precise eye placement and proportions, the exact shape and positioning of the fins. None of that is preserved in the fossil evidence at all. It's informed, reasonable artistic extrapolation, layered on top of hard scientific data, and it's important to recognize where the hard data ends and the artistic interpretation begins, because popular media consistently blurs that line until the artistic reconstruction starts getting treated, in the public imagination, as if it were an actual photograph of the extinct animal. This is, honestly, one of my biggest frustrations with how paleontology gets covered in viral content. A dramatic illustration is a hypothesis given visual form, based on the best current evidence, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. It is not a snapshot of the past. Every single dinosaur reconstruction you grew up with as a kid has likely been revised at least once, sometimes dramatically, as new fossil evidence and new analytical techniques emerged. There is no reason to expect Naniamoteuthis reconstructions to be any different, and in fact, I'd genuinely be surprised if our current visual understanding of this animal doesn't change meaningfully within the next decade, as more specimens are hopefully recovered. Let's widen the lens one more time before we head toward our conclusion, because Naniamoteuthis did not exist in an ecological vacuum populated only by reptiles, sharks, and fish. The late Cretaceous ocean was also home to an enormous, thriving diversity of other cephalopods, and understanding that broader cephalopod ecosystem tells us a lot about what a creature like Naniamoteuthis might have actually been eating, competing with, or avoiding. The single most dominant cephalopod group of the entire Mesozoic era was the ammonites, spiral-shelled relatives of modern nautiluses, though evolutionarily they sit closer, in some respects, to modern squid and octopus than to nautiluses in terms of soft tissue biology, despite the superficially nautilus-like external shell. Ammonites were staggeringly diverse, ranging from species barely a centimeter across to genuinely enormous forms. Parapuzotia sepenradensis, one of the largest ammonites ever discovered, had a shell diameter estimated at close to 2 meters, roughly 6.5 feet across, making it one of the largest shelled invertebrates in the history of life on this planet, entirely independent of the giant octopus story we've been following. Ammonites were almost certainly a major food source for a huge range of Cretaceous predators, precisely because their hard shells, unlike cephalopod soft tissue, fossilize extremely well, giving us direct physical evidence of predation. Paleontologists have recovered ammonite shells bearing exactly the kind of round, repeated puncture patterns consistent with cephalopod beak marks, alongside bite marks clearly attributable to mosasaurs and sharks. This tells us that ammonites occupied a critical mid-level position in the Cretaceous ocean food web, hunted by essentially everything larger than themselves, including, quite plausibly, other cephalopods. Then there were the belemnites, an extinct group of cephalopods more directly related to modern squid, distinguished by an internal, bullet-shaped hard structure called a guard, which, much like cephalopod beaks, fossilizes far more readily than the surrounding soft tissue ever could. Belemnites were abundant, fast-swimming, squid-like predators, and their guards are so common in certain Cretaceous rock formations that they're sometimes informally nicknamed thunderbolts by fossil collectors, due to their bullet-like shape and surprising abundance in certain sedimentary layers. Here's the fascinating ecological picture that emerges when you put all of this together. The late Cretaceous ocean supported multiple, simultaneously thriving cephalopod lineages, ranging from small, fast-swimming, squid-like belemnites to enormous, heavily armored ammonites nearly 2 meters across to, as we now know, potentially massive, soft-bodied, camouflaged finned octopuses reaching into the tens of meters in length. That is an extraordinary range of body plans, hunting strategies, and ecological niches, all occupied simultaneously by members of the same broad taxonomic group, in direct ecological competition with, and coexistence alongside, the reptiles and sharks that dominate our popular understanding of that era. Cephalopods, as a lineage, were not a footnote in the Cretaceous ocean. They were an entire, independently thriving ecosystem layer, every bit as diverse and ecologically important as the vertebrate predators that get all the documentary screen time. Nanematothus simply represents the upper size extreme of that already impressive diversity. The moment when this ancient, adaptable, soft-bodied lineage pushed its evolutionary experimentation as far as it apparently ever went, at least as far as current fossil evidence can tell us. And all of it, the ammonites, the belemnites, and very likely finned octopuses like Nanematothus along with them, vanished in the same catastrophic event that ended the age of dinosaurs. The asteroid impact at Chicxulub 66 million years ago, and the mass extinction that followed it. Ammonites, after surviving in the world's oceans for well over 300 million years through multiple previous mass extinction events, did not survive this one. Belemnites, similarly ancient and similarly successful, also disappeared entirely. It stands to reason, though direct fossil confirmation is understandably difficult given how rare cephalopod soft tissue fossilization already is, that Nanematothus and its close relatives met the same fate, their entire evolutionary experiment in giant size cut short by a single catastrophic, planet-altering event 72 million years after the last confirmed fossil evidence of their existence. Octopuses, as a broader lineage, did survive that extinction event. The ancestors of modern octopus diversity clearly made it through, since octopuses obviously still exist today. But whatever specific evolutionary path led to giant, Cretaceous-era finned octopuses reaching potentially 60 feet in length appears to have been permanently severed. As far as current evidence indicates, nothing alive today, including the largest living octopus species we know of, comes anywhere close to replicating that specific evolutionary achievement. Let's bring this back to the present day, because I think the most important question this entire story raises isn't really about the past at all. It's about right now. We opened this video by walking through just how recently humanity confirmed the existence of animals we now consider well-established, mainstream facts of marine biology. The giant squid, rumored for centuries, not photographed alive in the wild until 2004, not filmed until 2012. The colossal squid, not filmed alive in its natural habitat until December 2024. These aren't obscure, tiny organisms requiring an electron microscope to observe. These are, by any reasonable definition, sea monsters. Enormous, complex, intelligent predators. And we are talking about confirmation dates within living memory, in some cases within the last couple of years. Modern deep-sea exploration technology has improved dramatically, even just in the past decade. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, can now descend to depths and operate for durations that would have been unthinkable for earlier generations of ocean explorers, streaming high-definition, low-light video back to research vessels in real time. Environmental DNA sampling, often abbreviated as EDNA, allows researchers to detect the genetic traces that animals shed into the water around them. Skin cells, waste, mucus. Meaning scientists can sometimes confirm the presence of a species in a given area without ever directly observing or capturing the animal itself, simply by filtering and sequencing genetic material from a water sample. Deep-sea baited camera systems can be left unattended on the seafloor for weeks at a time, patiently waiting to capture footage of whatever wanders past, in environments no human diver could safely reach and no submersible could realistically monitor continuously. And even with all of that technology, marine biologists broadly, consistently acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of the deep ocean remains fundamentally unexplored. We have, at this point, arguably better topographic maps of the surfaces of the Moon, Mars, and even Venus than we have of significant portions of our own planet's ocean floor. That is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is a genuinely, frequently cited fact within the field of oceanography, and it should probably bother us more than it typically does. Every year, researchers formally describe new cephalopod species. Some small and easily overlooked, others genuinely large and startling. Deep-sea expeditions regularly capture footage of behaviors and creatures that don't match anything in existing scientific literature, requiring years of subsequent analysis before a formal description can even be attempted. Whale researchers continue to document sucker scars on sperm whales that don't match the size or pattern of any currently known squid species, suggesting, much as it did 2 centuries ago, that something out there remains uncatalogued. I'm not suggesting there's a literal, mythological kraken currently lurking in the deep ocean, waiting to be discovered fully formed and terrifying. That would be an irresponsible, unscientific claim, and I promised you at the start of this video that I'd give you the real, evidence-based story rather than unfounded speculation dressed up as fact. But I am suggesting, based entirely on the well-documented historical pattern we've walked through together over the past several hours, that the ocean has an extremely well-established track record of hiding genuinely enormous, genuinely intelligent animals from human science for far longer than seems reasonable, right up until the exact moment we finally develop the technology and dedicate the resources to look properly. The giant squid was real the entire time. It just took us roughly 200 years of dismissing eyewitness accounts to develop the tools necessary to prove it, and honestly, the willingness to take those eyewitness accounts seriously enough to keep looking. The colossal squid was real the entire time. We simply hadn't pointed a working camera at the right patch of Antarctic Ocean, at the right depth, at the right moment, until less than 2 years ago. Nanaia-Motoothis was real for approximately 18 million years, hunting, growing, potentially dominating an entire ancient ecosystem, and then it was gone, and its existence remained completely unknown and unsuspected by human science for a further 72 million years after its extinction. Right up until a research team in Japan finally looked closely enough at a box of unremarkable, previously misclassified fossil fragments to realize what they were actually holding. If that pattern has held consistently across multiple independent cases, spanning from ancient fossil evidence to living animals confirmed within the last 24 months, what confidence should any of us reasonably have that we've now found everything worth finding? What confidence should we have that some other, equally massive, equally intelligent cephalopod lineage isn't currently thriving in some unexplored trench or unmonitored stretch of open ocean, entirely unknown to science, right now, while you're watching this video? I don't think we should have much confidence in that at all. And honestly, I think that's one of the most exciting, rather than frightening, conclusions available to us. It means the era of major biological discovery on this planet is nowhere close to finished. It means there is still genuine, fundamental exploration left to do on our own planet, without needing a rocket ship, using nothing more exotic than a submersible, a research vessel, and the patience to keep looking in places most people never think to look. Let's bring this all the way back around to where we started. We opened this video with a question. What if everything we assumed about who ruled the ancient oceans was built on an incomplete picture? Not a wrong picture, necessarily. The mosasaurs really were enormous. The plesiosaurs really did dominate huge stretches of Cretaceous ocean. The sharks really were formidable, but incomplete, because the entire framework we built our understanding on was constructed almost exclusively from animals with bones, in a world where the fossil record fundamentally, structurally favors bones over soft tissue. Nanaia-Motoothis haggardii forces a correction to that picture, and I want to leave you with a clear, honest summary of exactly what we do and don't know, because I think that honesty is more valuable, and frankly more interesting, than any exaggerated headline. We know, with high confidence, based on direct physical measurement of 27 fossil beaks recovered from Japan and Canada, that a genus of finned octopus lived in late Cretaceous oceans between roughly 100 million and 72 million years ago, producing at least 2 distinguishable species, the older Nanaia-Motoothis gillespie and the larger, more recent Nanaia-Motoothis haggardii. We know the largest beaks recovered were roughly 1.5 times the size of beaks belonging to living giant squid. Direct physical evidence of an exceptionally large animal, independent of any extrapolation. We know, with reasonable but appropriately debated confidence that total body length estimates for the largest specimens range from roughly 22 to 61 feet, a range wide enough that legitimate experts continue to disagree about where within it the true figure most likely sits. We know, from wear patterns preserved directly on the fossil beaks, that this animal fed with significant, repeated force on tough prey, and that its feeding behavior may have shown consistent, lifelong asymmetry. A hint, however incomplete, of individual behavioral preference and potentially sophisticated neural processing, not unlike what we observe in its remarkable living relatives today. And we know, perhaps most importantly of all, that this discovery is not really the end of a story. It's the opening chapter of one. 27 beaks, recovered over what was likely decades of scattered fieldwork and collection across 2 countries, is a genuinely small sample size for an animal that, if the researchers' estimates are even roughly correct, lived across an evolutionary window spanning nearly 30 million years. Statistically, that sample almost certainly represents an infinitesimally small fraction of the total population of these animals that actually lived and died during that span. Future fieldwork, potentially targeting the same rock formations in Japan and British Columbia with the specific knowledge of what to look for that this study has now provided, could plausibly recover additional specimens. Potentially larger ones, potentially smaller ones, potentially specimens complete enough to finally resolve the size controversy we spent an entire chapter unpacking. That's genuinely thrilling to sit with, if you let yourself think about it properly. This isn't a closed case. Somewhere in a rock formation in coastal British Columbia, or in a fossil-bearing outcrop in Japan, there may be additional fragments of this exact same creature, patiently waiting, exactly the way the fragments that led to this discovery waited, for decades or longer, until the right person, asking the right question, finally picked them up. I want to close with the thought I planted at the very beginning of this video, because I think it deserves to be the thing you actually walk away remembering. For the entirety of recorded human history, we have consistently, repeatedly, almost stubbornly underestimated what the ocean is capable of hiding. We dismissed the Kraken as pure myth for 1,000 years before finally admitting the giant squid was real. We assumed, without much scrutiny, that the biggest, most dangerous predators of the prehistoric world had to be animals with backbones, simply because those were the animals that happened to leave behind evidence we could easily find and interpret. And in both cases, we were forced, eventually, humbly, and a little uncomfortably, to admit that reality was significantly stranger and significantly more impressive than our assumptions had allowed for. Nanaemotuthis haggardi is the latest, and arguably the most dramatic, entry in that long, humbling pattern. A creature potentially the length of a city bus, with no bones, no shell, and quite possibly a level of intelligence that outstrips almost every other predator it shared its ocean with, hiding in plain sight within the fossil record for over a century, misclassified, overlooked, sitting in a drawer, until a small team of dedicated researchers finally asked the right question of the right broken rock. If that story teaches us anything, it's that the phrase, "we know everything about prehistoric life," has never once been true, at any point in the history of paleontology, and it certainly isn't true today. Every single year, new fossils, new techniques, and new researchers continue to peel back layers of a history we thought we had already fully written. The next Nanaemotuthis might already be sitting in a museum drawer somewhere right now, waiting for the same kind of careful, patient, curious attention that finally revealed this one. And somewhere in the vast, still largely unexplored expanse of our modern ocean, its living descendants, and possibly entirely unknown relatives, are still out there right now, quietly going about their lives in the dark, waiting for us to finally develop the patience, the technology, and the curiosity to go looking properly. Before I let you go, I want to circle back to something I only briefly touched on at the very beginning of this video, because I think it deserves real attention. Why do sea monsters occupy such a permanent, unshakable place in human storytelling across nearly every seafaring culture in history, completely independent of each other? Norse sailors had the Kraken. Ancient Greek sailors had Scylla, a multi-headed monster said to guard a narrow strait, snatching sailors directly off the decks of passing ships. Japanese folklore includes stories of the umabozu, a massive, shadowy shape said to rise silently from calm water to capsize boats. Coastal communities in West Africa, in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean. Nearly every culture that has ever depended on the ocean for survival has independently produced some version of a hidden, enormous, intelligent predator lurking just beyond the edge of visibility. That is not a coincidence, and it's not simply a case of cultures borrowing stories from each other across vast distances and centuries. Psychologists and folklorists who study the origins of monster mythology generally point to a much simpler, more universal explanation. Humans are exceptionally good at recognizing patterns and detecting potential threats based on incomplete information, and the ocean is, by its very nature, the single largest source of incomplete information available to any pre-industrial society. You cannot see more than a few meters into even moderately clear water. You cannot know what's moving beneath your boat. And every so often, something genuinely does surface, or genuinely does damage a hull, or genuinely does leave behind evidence. A scarred whale, a strange carcass, a story from a sailor who swears he watched something the size of an island slide beneath the waves. And the human mind, quite reasonably, fills the gap between "we don't know" and "we need an explanation" with a story. The truly remarkable thing about the Kraken specifically, compared to most other mythological sea monsters, is that it turned out to have more basis in direct physical reality than almost any other example in the entire category. Scylla was very likely inspired by the genuine navigational hazards of the Strait of Messina, a real and dangerous body of water, but there's no compelling evidence of an actual multi-headed creature behind the myth. The umabozu almost certainly draws on real, rare oceanic phenomena and the psychological effect of encountering sudden swells or unusual wave activity in isolated, foggy conditions. But the Kraken had giant squid. Real, physical, confirmable giant squid, leaving behind real sucker scars on real sperm whales, real beaks in real stomach contents, and eventually, real photographic and video evidence. Of all the sea monster myths humanity ever produced, independently, across dozens of cultures, the Kraken is the one that turned out to be describing an actual biological phenomenon with startling, if exaggerated, accuracy. This matters for how we should think about Nanaomoteuthis and about the broader pattern of hidden ocean giants we've spent this entire video exploring. Human storytelling instincts, when applied to genuine gaps in our knowledge about the ocean, have a surprisingly good track record of pointing towards something real, even if the details get exaggerated or distorted along the way. That doesn't mean every sea monster legend is secretly describing an undiscovered species. Most clearly aren't. But it does suggest that dismissing ocean folklore entirely, treating every account of something enormous and unexplained in deep water as pure fantasy with zero informational value, has historically been the wrong strategy for science to take. The giant squid proved that. The colossal squid proved it again, less than 2 years ago. And in its own way, buried in fossil form for over 70 million years, Nanaomoteuthis proves it a third time, in an entirely different context. The lesson isn't believe every sea monster story. The lesson is, take the pattern of unexplained ocean phenomena seriously enough to keep looking. And that is precisely the mindset that led a small research team in Japan to finally look closely enough at a drawer full of misclassified fossils to change our understanding of an entire era of prehistoric life. It's easy, when a scientific story gets compressed into a headline or a short video, to lose track of the fact that real people, with real careers, real setbacks, and real years of unglamorous, patient work, are behind every discovery like this one. I want to take a few minutes to properly credit the human side of this story, because I think it matters, and because it's a useful corrective to the version of science communication that treats discoveries as if they simply appear, fully formed, out of nowhere. Shin Aikigami and the research team at Hokkaido University did not stumble onto this discovery by accident on a single lucky afternoon. Studies of this scope typically represent years of accumulated effort. Building relationships with multiple museum collections across 2 countries, securing the necessary permissions and funding to travel and examine specimens firsthand, developing or adapting the specific comparative analytical techniques needed to responsibly interpret fragmentary fossil material, and then going through the lengthy, often frustrating process of drafting, internally reviewing, submitting, and revising a manuscript for publication in a journal as competitive and rigorous as science. One of the most selective scientific publications in the entire world, where the large majority of submitted papers are rejected before ever reaching print. Hokkaido University itself has a long, well-established reputation in paleontology and marine biology, partly due to its geographic position, giving researchers relatively direct access to fossil-bearing rock formations across northern Japan that have produced significant Cretaceous marine fossils for decades. This wasn't a research group working from an unrelated field who happened to get lucky. This was a team operating within an institution with deep, accumulated expertise in exactly this kind of research, building on infrastructure, comparative databases, and specimen access that took generations of prior researchers to establish. It's also worth highlighting the broader collaborative and international nature of this kind of research. The specimens that made this discovery possible came from both Japan and Canada, meaning the research inherently depended on international cooperation between institutions, quite possibly involving researchers and curators from Canadian universities and museums who had been maintaining and cataloging the Nanaimo group fossil collections for years, entirely unaware that a handful of their specimens would eventually be reclassified as evidence of one of the largest invertebrates ever documented. And then there's the broader community of independent experts. People like Christian Klug at the University of Zurich and Zoe Hughes at the Natural History Museum in London, who play an absolutely essential, if less publicly celebrated, role in this entire process. Their job isn't to make discoveries themselves in every case. It's to serve as a rigorous, independent check on discoveries made by others, ensuring that exciting findings get subjected to genuine scrutiny before they become accepted as settled scientific understanding. That's a thankless, often uncelebrated role in science communication, because it doesn't generate the same viral excitement as the original discovery, but it is, in many ways, just as important to the overall integrity of the scientific process. I bring all of this up because I think it's genuinely important, especially in an era of short-form content where scientific discoveries get flattened into a single dramatic image and a 15-second voiceover, to remember that behind every one of these stories is a community of real scientists doing patient, careful, often unglamorous work, frequently disagreeing with each other in good faith, slowly, building a more accurate picture of the past through exactly the kind of rigorous back and forth we've spent this entire video unpacking. Let's close out with a few direct, honest answers to the questions I suspect a lot of you are sitting with right now, because I'd rather address them directly than leave them hanging. Could Nanaimo-toothus actually have hunted mosasaurs? The honest answer is, we don't have direct fossil evidence proving this specific interaction occurred, but it is a scientifically plausible hypothesis, not pure fantasy. We know Nanaimo-toothus had a powerful, heavily worn, crushing beak. We know it shared its ecosystem with juvenile and possibly smaller adult marine reptiles. We know its body plan, based on living relatives, suggests ambush-style predation rather than pursuit. Whether it specifically targeted marine reptiles, focused primarily on large fish, or fed opportunistically across a wide range of prey, remains genuinely unresolved, and any documentary or illustration depicting a specific predation event on a mosasaur should be understood as an artistic, hypothesis-driven reconstruction rather than a confirmed historical fact. Is the 61-foot estimate real or exaggerated? Both, in a sense, depending on how you define real. It is a real, published, peer-reviewed scientific estimate generated using an established and previously validated methodology. It is also the extreme upper end of a wide uncertainty range, built on an extrapolation method that credible independent experts have specifically flagged as being pushed toward the limits of what it can reliably support at this particular scale. The most responsible summary is that Nanaimo-toothus was almost certainly an exceptionally large cephalopod, quite possibly the largest ever documented, with a most likely size somewhere within that broad 22 to 61 foot range, and a precise figure that current evidence simply cannot pin down with full confidence. Why haven't we found a complete Nanaimo-toothus skeleton or a well-preserved body? Because, as we discussed at length, Nanaimo-toothus, like virtually all cephalopods, had no bones, no shell, and almost no hard tissue anywhere in its body apart from its beak. The chances of a soft-bodied animal like this fossilizing in any more complete form than isolated beaks are, realistically, close to zero, barring an extraordinarily rare set of preservation conditions that have essentially never been documented for any cephalopod of this size and age. We may never find more than beaks for this particular species, which is precisely why every single beak that does turn up matters enormously to researchers. Is Nanaomoteuthis related to modern octopuses that I might see in an aquarium? Yes, in the sense that both belong to the broader order Octopoda, but no, in the sense that its closest living relatives are specifically the deep-sea finned octopuses, the Serrata, the small, gentle, Dumbo octopus-type animals, rather than the more familiar, aggressive reef octopuses most people picture when they think of the word octopus. The common octopus you might see at a public aquarium is only a distant cousin within the broader octopus family tree, not a direct comparison point for imagining what Nanaomoteuthis actually looked like or how it behaved. Could something this large still be alive today, undiscovered? Based on current evidence, this is extremely unlikely, and I want to be responsible here rather than chase a dramatic conclusion the facts don't support. Nanaomoteuthis appears, based on the age range of every recovered fossil, to have gone extinct around 72 million years ago, likely as part of the same mass extinction event that ended the age of dinosaurs. There is no credible fossil or genetic evidence suggesting this specific lineage persisted beyond that point. What is genuinely, scientifically plausible, and what we spent real time establishing earlier in this video, is that other large, currently undiscovered cephalopod species may well exist in today's oceans. Just very likely not this exact species, and not at a confirmed size rivaling the most extreme Nanaomoteuthis estimates. I think those 5 questions cover the majority of the understandable curiosity and skepticism this story tends to generate, and I'd genuinely rather leave you with careful, hedged, honest answers than the kind of overconfident certainty that makes for a punchier ending but a less accurate one. I want to spend some real time on the ending of this story, because I don't think we can properly understand Nanaomoteuthis without properly understanding the catastrophe that almost certainly wiped it, and the vast majority of its relatives, off the face of the planet. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across struck the shallow sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico, at a location geologists now call the Chicxulub crater, named after a small nearby town. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of times the largest nuclear weapons ever detonated by humans. It triggered immediate, catastrophic regional devastation, massive tsunamis, wildfires ignited by thermal radiation across enormous distances, and earthquakes powerful enough to be felt and to leave physical evidence on the opposite side of the planet. But the immediate blast, as unimaginably violent as it was, is not actually what caused the mass extinction that followed. The real killer was what happened afterward, over the following months and years. The impact vaporized an enormous volume of sulfur-rich rock at the impact site, launching it into the upper atmosphere, where it combined with atmospheric moisture and spread globally as a dense veil of aerosols. Combined with soot from continent-scale wildfires, this created what researchers describe as a prolonged, planet-wide impact winter. A period of dramatically reduced sunlight, plummeting global temperatures, and the collapse of photosynthesis-based food chains across both land and ocean environments, lasting, by various estimates, anywhere from several months to several years. Here's why this matters specifically for our story. The ocean food web that Nanaomoteuthis depended on for its entire existence was fundamentally built on a foundation of sunlight-driven productivity. Phytoplankton at the base, converting sunlight into usable energy, supporting everything above it in the food chain, all the way up to the largest predators. When that sunlight was effectively cut off on a planetary scale for an extended period, phytoplankton populations crashed catastrophically, and that collapse propagated up through every single trophic level above it with devastating speed. This is precisely why marine ecosystems were hit so disproportionately hard by this particular extinction event, even compared to many land-based ecosystems. Detailed geological and fossil evidence shows that an estimated 75% of all species on Earth went extinct in a geologically instantaneous window following the impact. Instantaneous meaning, in geological terms, potentially within a period as short as a few years to a few tens of thousands of years, rather than the millions of years typically associated with normal background rates of extinction. Ammonites, having survived for well over 300 million years through multiple previous mass extinctions, including the catastrophic end Permian extinction that wiped out an estimated 90% or more of all marine species roughly 252 million years ago, did not survive this one. Belemnites, similarly ancient, similarly resilient, also disappeared completely. Every non-avian dinosaur species died out. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs that had dominated Cretaceous oceans for tens of millions of years vanished entirely, leaving no descendants. We have no direct fossil evidence definitively confirming exactly when Nanaomoteuthis itself went extinct, because, as we've established repeatedly throughout this video, cephalopod soft tissue essentially never survives to leave that kind of clear, datable record. What we do know is that every single confirmed Nanaomoteuthis fossil recovered so far dates to no later than approximately 72 million years ago, a full 6 million years before the Chicxulub impact. This creates a genuinely interesting open question that current evidence cannot resolve. Did this specific lineage of giant-finned octopus already go extinct through some other, unrelated cause several million years before the asteroid impact even occurred? Or does the current absence of fossils younger than 72 million years simply reflect the extraordinarily poor preservation odds facing any soft-bodied cephalopod, meaning the lineage could plausibly have persisted right up until the mass extinction itself without leaving any additional fossil evidence to prove it? This is a great example of a question that sounds like it should have a simple, findable answer, but that the physical reality of the fossil record may never actually allow us to resolve with full confidence. It's entirely possible that we will never know, with certainty, exactly when or why Nanaomoteuthis haggardi's specific lineage disappeared from Earth's oceans, and that uncertainty itself is a meaningful, honest part of this story, not a gap to be papered over with confident-sounding speculation. What we can say with much higher confidence is that octopuses as a broader lineage clearly did survive the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, given that octopuses obviously exist today, spread across virtually every ocean on the planet, from shallow tropical reefs to the crushing pressure of the deepest ocean trenches. Whatever specific evolutionary and ecological factors allowed some octopus lineages to survive a catastrophe that eliminated 75% of all species on the planet, while an entire branch of giant, apex predator finned octopuses apparently did not persist, at least not at anything close to the scale Nanaomoteuthis reached, remains an active, genuinely open area of ongoing paleontological research. There's something quietly poignant, I think, in recognizing that an animal potentially as large, as capable, and as cognitively sophisticated as Nanaomoteuthis may have simply ended, abruptly and without warning, in a planetary catastrophe it had absolutely no capacity to perceive coming, understand, or escape. Whatever intelligence it possessed, whatever hunting strategies it had refined over millions of years of evolutionary success, none of it mattered in the face of an asteroid impact and the years of planetary darkness that followed. That's not a uniquely cephalopod tragedy. It's the exact same fate that befell the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, and every non-avian dinosaur on the planet. But it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close this story out, because it's easy to get swept up in the sheer spectacle of giant sea monster and lose sight of the fact that we're ultimately talking about a real, living, breathing animal with a real evolutionary history that met a real and almost certainly abrupt end. Let's do one final piece of math together, because I think it puts the entire scale of this discovery into proper perspective in a way that raw size estimates alone don't quite manage. Based on the age range of the fossils recovered, the older species, Nanaomoteuthis gillespieia, appears to have existed from roughly 100 million years ago until roughly 72 million years ago, a span of approximately 28 million years. The larger species, Nanaomoteuthis haggardi, appears in the fossil record somewhat later, persisting from roughly 86 million years ago until that same approximate 72 million year cutoff, a span of about 14 million years on its own, though of course potentially overlapping with or descending directly from populations of the earlier species. Put those together, and you get a genus of giant-finned octopus that appears to have persisted, in some form, for somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 million years. To put that in a time frame you can actually hold in your head, modern Homo sapiens, as a species, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. The entire span of recorded human civilization, from the earliest cities to right now, covers roughly 6,000 years. Nenemoteuthis, as an evolutionary lineage, persisted for a length of time somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 times longer than the entire history of human civilization. That is not a brief, anomalous evolutionary blip. That is a genuinely, remarkably successful, long-term apex predator lineage, thriving continuously across an enormous span of geological time, adapting, presumably diversifying into at least the two species we've currently identified, and by every indication we have, occupying a dominant ecological position for the overwhelming majority of that entire multi-million-year run. And for the entire duration of that reign, every single year of those 25 to 30 million years, human science had absolutely no idea it had ever existed, right up until a research team in the 21st century finally looked closely enough at a drawer of unremarkable fossil fragments to notice what they were actually holding. I think that fact, more than the size estimate, more than the controversy, more than even the tantalizing hints of sophisticated intelligence, is the single most important takeaway from this entire story. We are not talking about a brief, freakish evolutionary accident that produced one unusually large individual before promptly going extinct. We are talking about an entire, successful, multi-million-year predatory dynasty, potentially rivaling or exceeding the largest vertebrate predators of its era in size, that operated in complete, total obscurity from the perspective of human knowledge for the entire span of recorded scientific history until extremely recently. If an entire multi-million-year predatory dynasty of this scale and success can remain completely unknown to science for this long, hidden not by rarity or by living in some genuinely inaccessible corner of the planet, but simply by the basic physical reality of how soft tissue decomposes, then I think we have to seriously, honestly reconsider how much confidence we should place in any claim that we've now got a reasonably complete picture of what has lived, hunted, and thrived across the history of this planet's oceans. We don't. We almost certainly don't. And every honest paleontologist and marine biologist working today would likely tell you the same thing if you asked them directly and gave them the space to answer without needing to sound reassuringly confident for a headline. The ocean has been quietly rewriting its own history behind our backs for the entire span of human civilization. And every few years, if we're patient enough and curious enough and willing to look closely enough at things that initially seem unremarkable, it hands us back one more chapter of a story we didn't even know we were missing. Before we close, I want to hand you something practical. A way of thinking that I hope you carry with you the next time a headline or a short-form video shows up in your feed, claiming to have found the next giant sea monster, the next record-breaking fossil, the next creature that changes everything we thought we knew. Because if this video has done its job properly, you now have all the tools you need to evaluate those claims yourself, rather than simply accepting or dismissing them based on how dramatic the thumbnail looks. First, ask what the actual physical evidence is versus what has been extrapolated from that evidence. In our story, the physical evidence was unambiguous and directly measurable. 27 fossil beaks, with 1.5 times the size of a modern giant squid beak at the largest end. That part of the story required no leap of faith at all. The extrapolated part. The 22 to 61-foot body length range required additional assumptions, comparative modeling, and inherently carries more uncertainty. Both parts of the story are legitimate and worth knowing, but they deserve different levels of confidence, and a responsible retelling should always make clear which is which. Second, ask whether the claim has been peer-reviewed, and if so, whether other qualified experts in the same specific subfield have had a chance to respond publicly. A study published in a serious, selective journal like Science has already cleared a meaningful bar of scrutiny before publication. But as we saw clearly in this exact story, publication is the beginning of scrutiny, not the end of it. The existence of thoughtful, credentialed pushback, like Christian Klug's specific concerns about the extrapolation method, isn't a sign that the discovery is fraudulent or unimportant. It's a sign that the scientific process is functioning exactly the way it's supposed to. Be appropriately suspicious of any science content in any format that presents a brand new finding as if it were instantly, universally settled fact with zero dissenting expert opinion, because that kind of manufactured certainty is almost always a simplification introduced by the retelling, not a reflection of the actual state of the science. Third, separate the artistic reconstruction from the data. Every dramatic illustration, every CGI animation, every "here's what it probably looked like" visual you encounter is an interpretation built by an artist or animator working from the available data, filling in enormous amounts of detail that the fossil evidence simply cannot provide. That doesn't make those illustrations worthless. They're often incredibly valuable for public engagement and for helping non-specialists visualize genuinely abstract scientific findings. But they should never be mistaken for photographic evidence of what actually existed. And you should be specifically skeptical of any illustration that leans toward maximum dramatic size and menace, because that specific artistic choice tends to track engagement and virality far more reliably than it tracks scientific accuracy. Fourth, and this is probably the most important habit of all, get comfortable sitting with a range of uncertainty instead of demanding a single, clean number. Real science, almost without exception, produces ranges, confidence intervals, and ongoing debate rather than immediate, tidy, universally agreed upon answers. A 22 to 61 foot range isn't a failure of the original research. It's an honest, appropriately hedged reflection of the genuine limits of what current evidence can tell us. Content that strips away that range and presents only the most dramatic single number, without any acknowledgement of the uncertainty behind it, is prioritizing your attention over your actual understanding. And once you start noticing that pattern, you'll see it constantly in reporting on everything from paleontology to nutrition science to economic forecasting. I bring all of this up not to make you distrust science, but for exactly the opposite reason. Understanding how science actually works, messy disagreements and all, should make you trust the overall process more, not less, because you can see for yourself that it's specifically designed to catch and correct overconfident claims over time through exactly the kind of open, public, expert disagreement we walked through together in this video. The version of this story you saw in that original short-form clip wasn't lying to you, exactly. It just compressed an enormously rich, nuanced, still unfolding scientific conversation into 15 seconds of dramatic visuals and a single eye-popping number, because that's what the format demands, and that compression, repeated across millions of pieces of short-form science content every single day, quietly shapes how an entire generation understands what science actually is and how it actually works. My hope, with a video like this one, running well over 2 hours instead of 15 seconds, is to give you the fuller version back. Not because the short version was worthless. It's genuinely what got you curious enough to end up here in the first place. But because the fuller version is where the real, lasting fascination actually lives, and I think you deserve access to it. Thank you for spending this time with me on what turned out to be a much bigger story than a single viral video ever could have told you. If you found this as genuinely fascinating as I did putting it together, let me know in the comments which prehistoric mystery you'd want unpacked with this same level of depth next time, and I'll see you in the next one. One last thing before I let you go, because I think it's the image I actually want to leave you with. More than any statistic or any chart we've walked through together over these last 2.5 hours. Somewhere right now, in a research vessel's cold storage locker, or in a university collection room lined with unassuming gray metal cabinets, there is very likely another drawer. Another box of fragments, collected years or decades ago, labeled with a best guess that nobody has had the time, the expertise, or simply the occasion to properly question. Fossil collections around the world are full of exactly this kind of material. Specimens gathered faster than the global research community can ever fully analyze them, sitting patiently, sometimes for a century or more, waiting for the right person to walk in, pick up the right piece, and ask the one question that finally unlocks what it actually is. That's not a metaphor. That's a literal, documented, extremely common occurrence in the history of paleontology. Significant fossils have been rediscovered in museum drawers decades after their initial, incorrect classification, on more occasions than most people would ever guess. The Nanemoteuthis beaks themselves sat labeled as vampire squid material for years before anyone circled back with the right comparative framework to notice the mismatch. So here's the actual, honest, slightly haunting thought I want to leave you with. It's entirely possible, genuinely, scientifically possible, not just narratively convenient, that an even larger, even stranger, even more significant fossil is sitting in an unremarkable drawer somewhere on this planet right now, mislabeled, unexamined, waiting. It might be a cephalopod even larger than Nanaomoteuthis. It might be something from an entirely different branch of the invertebrate family tree that nobody has even thought to look for yet. It might be something that doesn't fit comfortably into any category we currently have. We don't know. Nobody knows. And that, more than any single number in this entire video, is exactly why paleontology, marine biology, and the broader project of understanding the true history of life on this planet remains some of the most genuinely open, unfinished, and exciting fields of scientific inquiry still available to us today. The age of discovery didn't end when the last blank spot on the world map got filled in centuries ago. It just moved into museum drawers, ocean trenches, and rock formations most people will never think twice about. And it is, right now, very much still underway. So the next time you stand at the edge of the ocean, at night, and look out at that flat, dark, endless-seeming horizon, remember this story. Remember that for most of human history, we assumed we understood roughly what was out there, and we were wrong, over and over again, in ways that kept surprising us right up to the present day. The water hasn't changed. Our understanding of it has, again and again, and it will almost certainly change again before either of us is done watching. And somewhere out past where the light gives out, something we haven't named yet is almost certainly still waiting.